The faintest whisper of a signal echoed through the vast emptiness of space, barely detectable by Earth's most advanced systems. For years, humanity had monitored the stars, hoping for signs of intelligent life beyond our own world. Yet nothing had prepared them for what came next. The message was distressing. Short bursts of alien words, barely coherent, but laden with terror. The voice of an alien civilization, desperate for help. The message repeated over and over, echoing across space. "We are dying. The invasion is coming. Only you can stop them." Captain Elias, once a decorated hero of the Galactic Federation, now sat in a barely functional command chair, his hands gripping the arms as he listened to the message. His fleet was the weakest humanity had to offer, aging ships that had long been decommissioned, hastily repaired and retrofitted to form the only defense force capable of answering the call. His fleet had been tasked with patrolling the borders, a peacekeeping role that had grown monotonous. They weren't fighters, not in the way humanity's elite forces were, but this alien message demanded an answer. There was no time to waste. Elias had been leading these ships, a ragtag group of misfits, for nearly a decade. His crew was a mix of inexperienced soldiers, technical geniuses who preferred tinkering over combat, and veterans who were long past their prime. Most of them had joined out of necessity, or because there were no better options, not because they were eager to face down the galaxy's most powerful enemies. But now, against all odds, they had to face an enemy none of them were prepared for. The aliens spoke of a force unlike anything humanity had seen, an advanced, relentless species with a reputation for exterminating entire civilizations. They were on the move, and the fleet that had once defended planets from minor skirmishes was now humanity's last line of defense. Elias felt a knot in his stomach as he looked out over his fleet. Each ship was barely holding together, barely capable of space travel, and none of them were designed for warfare. They were far from ready, and their chances of surviving even the first battle seemed slim. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, something stirred within him. This was not a time for hesitation. Earth's fate hung in the balance, and no one else was coming to help. Elias stared at the screen, the alien message replaying in his mind. Only you can stop them. The decision was made. He ordered his fleet to set course for the unknown coordinates, where the aliens had indicated the invasion would begin. The crew, though scared, followed their orders. Their mission was clear: protect humanity at all costs. But as they journeyed deeper into space, doubt began to creep in. Would they be able to face this alien threat? Could they stop a force that was far beyond their capabilities? As the fleet approached the coordinates, the tension was palpable. Officers shuffled nervously at their posts, technicians frantically running diagnostic checks, and soldiers prepared for combat, though none of them had ever seen battle. Captain Elias stood at the front of his ship, looking out at the stars, his mind racing. This was a war no one had expected, with no guarantees of survival. But it was their war now. The silence of space was broken by the sudden roar of engines as the fleet moved into the unknown, the stars fading into the darkness ahead. There was no turning back. They were humanity's weakest fleet, but in this moment, they were all that stood between the galaxy and annihilation. And they were going to fight with everything they had. Captain Elias stood at the bridge of the Elysian, his flagship, watching as the small fleet of aging ships made their way toward the coordinates. The stars around them were distant, cold, and indifferent to the fragile humans trying to brave their way into the heart of a battle they were never meant to fight. He could hear the hum of the engines, a sound that once comforted him, now filled him with dread. His eyes shifted across the faces of the crew, and he saw the uncertainty reflected in their eyes. Everyone knew the stakes, but no one dared speak the unspoken fear. How could they hope to survive against a foe so much more powerful than them? The crew had been busy preparing since the moment the decision was made, and the atmosphere on the Elysian had shifted from quiet trepidation to a sense of focused urgency. But preparation could only go so far. The fleet was a mishmash of ships, old, patched-up vessels from all across Earth's colonies, none of which were ever designed to withstand an invasion of this scale. They weren't built for war, and it showed. The Aurora, a massive cruiser that should have been decommissioned years ago, had rust streaking down its hull. The Odyssey, once a state-of-the-art reconnaissance vessel, now limped along, its navigation system glitching with every passing hour. Even the weapons systems on all the ships had been cobbled together with spare parts, making them unpredictable at best. But they were all they had. Elias ran a hand over his face as he leaned against the console, staring out into the endless void. His mind was racing. He had a crew of untested soldiers, engineers and volunteers, none of whom were battle-hardened. Many had joined the fleet out of necessity, some because they believed in the cause, and others because there were no other options. Most of them were as scared as he was. In many ways, Elias felt the same. Fear gnawed at him in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. But there was something else, too: determination. A stubbornness that, despite the odds, made him believe that they could somehow pull this off. It was then that the communications officer, Lieutenant Mira, called out, pulling him from his thoughts. "Captain, we've received a new transmission from the alien race. It's a distress signal. They've been intercepted. The invaders are close." Elias moved swiftly, his boots echoing on the cold metal floor as he approached the communication console. Mira, young but sharp, handed him the data pad, showing the message. This one was different. It wasn't the same frantic plea as before. This one was a warning. "Captain, they're coming faster than expected," Mira said, voice trembling slightly. "They're already advancing toward our position. The enemy fleet's movement is coordinated. They're not wasting any time." Elias stared at the datapad, a sinking feeling in his chest. The aliens had mentioned this, an invader so relentless that no one could stop them. But now, the fleet was moments away from being caught in their grip. He turned back to Mira, his mind racing. "How much time do we have?" "Not much. Based on the speed they're moving, we're looking at less than 24 hours before they reach us," she said. "We're outmatched, Captain. We have no idea what we're up against." There was a moment of silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Elias exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. They could turn back, go back to Earth, and admit they weren't strong enough to face this threat. But that would mean the death of countless others. The alien species, according to the intercepted messages, would not stop at Earth. They would wipe out everything in their path. And Earth would be next. The crew waited for his command. He could feel the pressure of their eyes on him, the tension in the room thickening as he considered their options. "Prepare the fleet. Full readiness," he ordered, his voice steady but firm. "We don't turn back. Not now. We fight." He turned to face the large screen in front of him, where the stars stretched out, distant and cold. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but his resolve remained. He wasn't just commanding a fleet of ships. He was commanding humanity's will to survive. Elias could feel the crew springing into action around him. The sound of footsteps, the hurried calls to the engineering teams, the quick shuffling of crew members going over tactical plans. There was a sense of urgency in the air that had shifted the ship's atmosphere from doubt to something more. This was no longer a group of misfits. It was a team, a unit bound by one purpose. As the fleet approached the coordinates, Elias found himself pacing back and forth. He hadn't been in combat in years. His days of leading great battles were behind him. And this new role, the role of a leader of this fleet, one that was weak in every way, felt foreign to him. But the reality of the situation was inescapable. His crew, these ordinary people, had to step up. And they would, or they wouldn't survive. There was no middle ground. "Captain," the voice of Lieutenant Mira interrupted his thoughts again. She was at the communication panel. "We're receiving another transmission from the aliens. It's urgent." Elias' stomach tightened as he approached the console. He had expected the aliens to plead for help, to beg for rescue. But what he saw on the screen was different. It was a message of strategy, a call for their help, but also a warning. The aliens weren't asking for assistance. They were trying to delay the inevitable. The invaders were coming, and there was no one else to stop them. His eyes narrowed as he read the message. The situation had just become far more real. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was survival. Their survival. Elias turned back to face the crew, his gaze steady and resolute. "We've got one shot at this. We're going to make it count." The crew's eyes met his, no longer filled with doubt, but with something else. Determination. They were ready. Ready to fight. The enemy was coming, and they were the last line of defense. The fleet was now in the heart of enemy territory, the eerie silence of space pressing down on them like a heavy weight. The distant stars flickered like tiny pinpricks of light, indifferent to the dire situation unfolding. Captain Elias stood at the bridge, his eyes fixed on the screen as it displayed the incoming coordinates. His fingers drummed nervously on the console, each passing second bringing them closer to an encounter they were ill prepared for. The alien fleet was vast, far larger than their own, and it was already within range. There was no turning back now. "Captain, we're entering the enemy's detection zone," Mira reported, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "They're aware of our presence." Elias nodded grimly. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers, everyone. Stay alert. We need to buy as much time as we can." His words were calm, but inside, his mind was racing. They were about to face an opponent they couldn't fully comprehend, a force so advanced that they had no idea what weapons or tactics would be used against them. As the fleet moved deeper into the alien-controlled space, the first signs of the enemy fleet appeared on the radar, blips that grew larger with every passing moment. The ships were enormous, their sleek, dark designs almost unnatural against the backdrop of the stars. The overwhelming size of their fleet was immediately apparent, and it sent a chill down Elias' spine. Each ship was a fortress, capable of obliterating entire planets with a single strike. This was no skirmish. This was a battle for survival. On the Elysian, the crew moved swiftly, working in sync despite their lack of experience. The tactical officers worked tirelessly, scanning the alien ships, trying to identify weaknesses, but everything was a guess. There was no data on this enemy, no intel that could help them. They had to rely on their wits, their unpredictability, and the hope that the enemy might underestimate them. The first exchange of fire came unexpectedly. A bright flash of light streaked across the vast expanse, followed by a deafening boom that rattled the ship. The Elysian rocked violently, throwing several crew members to the floor. Alarms blared, and smoke began to fill the bridge. But Elias didn't flinch. He held on to the command chair, his eyes focused on the screen as he barked out orders. "Return fire. All ships, engage at maximum capacity. Target their engines." The fleet's ships fired their weapons, sending blasts of energy into the void. The beams of light were small compared to the vastness of space, but they were all they had. The alien ships responded with terrifying speed and precision, returning fire with powerful energy blasts that sent shockwaves through the fleet. The Odyssey was the first to fall, a massive explosion tearing it apart as the invaders' weapons slammed into its hull. The debris scattered across the void, and Elias watched helplessly as the ship disintegrated, taking with it the lives of dozens of his crew. "Sir, the Odyssey is lost," the tactical officer yelled. "We've taken significant damage. Shields are down on the Aurora." Elias clenched his fists. The loss of the Odyssey was a heavy blow, but they couldn't afford to dwell on it. The enemy was closing in, and every second counted. "Focus on defense. Don't let them break through our lines. We need to hold them off until we can get a plan together." But the enemy was relentless. Their ships moved with terrifying coordination, cutting through the fleet with ease. It became clear that their weapons were far superior to anything humanity had ever seen. The Elysian fired back, but the enemy's shields absorbed the shots effortlessly. leaving them with little chance of doing significant damage. "Captain, the alien ships are launching smaller crafts, boarding vessels," Mira shouted. "They're preparing for a full assault." Elias felt his stomach drop. Boarding ships meant one thing: hand-to-hand combat. The aliens weren't just interested in destroying them from a distance. They intended to board and take the fleet from within. The thought of an alien invasion inside the very ships meant to defend humanity was terrifying. "All hands, prepare for close-quarters combat," Elias ordered, his voice sharp. "Defend the ships at all costs." The first alien boarding craft slammed into the side of the Elysian, its dark, metallic exterior scraping against the hull as it latched on with magnetic force. The crew scrambled to position themselves in the corridors, preparing for the inevitable breach. Elias moved quickly through the ship, his mind racing with the possibilities. He knew that this was a turning point. If they couldn't repel the boarders, they wouldn't survive. On the bridge, the sounds of explosions and gunfire began to echo through the corridors. The ship was being rocked by impacts from the enemy crafts, and it was clear that the invaders had already breached several levels of the ship. Crew members ran past him, weapons in hand, their faces grim. Elias could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts flickered to his crew. These were the people who had trusted him, and they were now fighting for their lives. "Captain," Mira called over the comms, her voice tinged with panic. "We've got enemy forces on the lower decks. We can't hold them off for long. They're too strong." Elias gritted his teeth. This wasn't a fight they could win through sheer firepower alone. It was about survival now, about using every ounce of strategy, cunning, and determination to outlast their attackers. They had to outsmart the aliens. "All ships, form up. Target their boarding ships. We need to stop them before they can do any more damage." As the crew worked together, Elias took a moment to glance at the vast darkness outside the bridge. The enemy fleet loomed like a shadow over them, waiting for the final strike. But there was something else, something they hadn't anticipated. The enemy's overwhelming force was now its weakness. They were arrogant, underestimating the ingenuity of humanity. Elias clenched his jaw. They might be outnumbered, they might be outgunned, but they weren't going to give up. "We fight for every second, every breath," Elias muttered to himself. "We fight until the last ship falls. Humanity doesn't give up. Not today." With that thought, he turned back to the battle, watching as his fleet did everything they could to keep the invaders at bay. Each strike, each counterattack, no matter how small, felt like a defiant cry in the face of overwhelming odds. They were human, and they would not go down without a fight. The battle raged on, the stars outside the fleet flickering like distant candles in the ever-deepening darkness. The invaders' ships, massive and sleek, moved with terrifying precision, cutting through the human fleet with cold efficiency. The Elysian and its remaining allies fought back with everything they had: blazing energy weapons, hastily modified defense systems, and weapons that were cobbled together from the remnants of ancient technology. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. On the lower decks of the Elysian, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The alien invaders had breached the hull, and their forces had made it onto the ship. Elias, leading a team of elite soldiers, moved swiftly through the narrow corridors, his boots thumping against the cold metal floor. The sounds of combat echoed around him: laser fire, explosions, and the muffled cries of those engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The crew was holding their ground, but each passing minute brought them closer to losing it all. The aliens weren't just soldiers, they were predators, driven by an instinctual hunger for dominance. Their advanced armor and weapons made them nearly unstoppable in close combat. But humanity's strength wasn't in brute force. It was in their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their relentless will to survive. Elias knew they had to use everything at their disposal, every trick, every advantage they could find. As the team rounded a corner, they were met with a wave of alien warriors. Their sharp, glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The soldiers moved quickly, launching themselves into action, firing their weapons with precision. But the aliens were faster, their movements fluid and graceful, almost as if they were in perfect sync with their surroundings. They fought with an elegance that made them all the more terrifying. "Hold the line," Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He aimed his weapon at one of the alien invaders, the blast sending it reeling back, but it wasn't enough to stop the oncoming tide. They were outmatched, and the enemy kept coming. The sounds of battle echoed louder, mingling with the roar of engines from above, where the remaining ships in the fleet were engaged in a desperate defense. The Aurora, its shields failing, was caught in the crossfire. But the crew kept firing back, trying to buy their comrades more time. On the command deck of the Elysian, Mira was working furiously to reroute power to the failing defense systems. Sweat dripped from her brow as she tapped away at the console, trying to keep the ship from falling apart at the seams. "Captain," Mira's voice crackled through the comms, "we're losing power to the main systems. We're vulnerable. I need more time." Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They couldn't afford to wait. The enemy was closing in, and they were running out of time. The battle wasn't just happening in the corridors. It was happening on every level of the Elysian. The situation was slipping from their grasp, and the aliens knew it. "Do whatever you can, Mira," Elias said, his voice hard and resolute. "We'll hold them off down here." But just as Elias prepared to lead another charge, the comm system crackled once more, this time with a voice he didn't recognize. "Captain Elias, we have a problem." It was Lieutenant Soren, one of the Elysian's tactical officers. "We've detected a massive energy surge on the enemy fleet. Something's coming through, something big." Elias' heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, something big?" Before Soren could respond, the ship was rocked violently, as if a giant hand had gripped it and shaken it mercilessly. The walls around Elias groaned, and sparks flew from exposed wiring. He stumbled but managed to keep his footing. The ground beneath them trembled, and a deep hum filled the air, an ominous sound that seemed to come from the very core of the alien fleet. The hum intensified, reverberating through the ship, and then, all at once, it stopped. Elias rushed to the nearest console, his heart pounding. "What was that?" It's a super weapon." Soren's voice came through, trembling with disbelief. "They're charging something powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet in one blow. It's coming right at us." The reality of the situation slammed into Elias like a wave. The Elysian, its crew, and the remnants of the fleet were sitting ducks, vulnerable and exposed. They had no chance of surviving against such a weapon, unless they could somehow disable it before it was too late. Elias turned to his team. "We need to destroy that weapon, now. If they fire it, we're finished. We fight our way to that superweapon, and we end this." The crew nodded, their faces grim. It wasn't just about fighting off the invaders anymore. It was about stopping the weapon that could erase them from existence. They moved quickly, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the odds of success were slim at best, but it was the only choice they had. As they made their way deeper into the bowels of the ship, the corridors seemed darker, the air more oppressive. The distant sounds of battle faded, and all that was left was the pounding of their footsteps, echoing off the metal walls. The alien forces had spread throughout the ship, and every turn presented new threats. They fought back, using every ounce of their training, but it was clear the aliens were not going to make it easy for them. Elias had never faced a more dangerous foe. Finally, they reached the heart of the ship. The superweapon was located deep within the Elysian's command center, surrounded by layers of security and alien forces. Elias' pulse quickened as he approached the control room, knowing they had only one chance. They had to disable the weapon before it could fire. The doors to the control room were heavy and reinforced. They slammed open with a hiss, revealing a room filled with alien technology and a faint blue glow emanating from a massive cylindrical structure in the center. The superweapon was enormous, its core pulsing with energy. Alien soldiers were stationed around it, their eyes glowing menacingly. The fight was inevitable. Without hesitation, Elias and his team charged forward. The sound of blasters firing, the sharp crack of metal against bone, filled the air. But even as the aliens fell, they kept coming. The team fought with every ounce of their strength, pushing forward through the chaos. Elias could see the weapon now, just a few steps away. But it was surrounded by a powerful energy field, and it was clear they needed to disable it before they could destroy the weapon itself. "Cover me," Elias yelled as he sprinted toward the console. His hand shook as he worked to deactivate the force field, his mind racing. He could hear the sound of aliens closing in behind him, but he couldn't afford to look back. Not now. The fate of the entire fleet, and perhaps the entire human race, rested in his hands. Elias' hands moved quickly over the control panel, sweat beading on his forehead as the hum of the energy field surrounding the weapon vibrated through the air. Each second felt like an eternity as his mind raced, fighting against the impending destruction. The alien forces were closing in around him, and every few moments, the sound of another crew member falling could be heard behind him. But Elias couldn't afford to look back. He couldn't afford to falter. The field generator was a complex piece of alien technology, something beyond human understanding. But Elias had no choice but to try. His eyes flickered over the glowing blue lines of code that filled the display in front of him, trying to make sense of it all. The symbols were unfamiliar, but somehow they made sense. His fingers moved instinctively, tapping in sequence, feeling the system respond with subtle hums and pulses. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like the technology would bend to his will, but then the console flashed red. The energy field buzzed, flaring brighter. He cursed under his breath and turned to his team. "Keep them off me. I'm almost there." The sound of blaster fire and the cries of his team echoed around him as the aliens pushed forward. The soldiers were fighting with the same ferocity they had shown since the moment they'd been thrust into this impossible battle, but Elias could feel the weight of their exhaustion. They had fought tooth and nail for hours, and the enemies they faced never seemed to tire. He saw one of his crew members go down, an alien blade piercing through their chest. He didn't have time to process it. He couldn't afford to lose focus. The energy field flickered again. He was close now, so close. His mind flashed back to the promise he'd made to the crew when they set out. "We'll survive. We'll win." Those words, once simple and full of resolve, now carried the weight of 1,000 lives. If he failed here, it wouldn't just be the crew of the Elysian that would fall. It would be the entire human race. Another burst of alien fire narrowly missed him, and Elias ducked instinctively, his heart pounding. The air was thick with tension. He had to act fast. The alien forces had become more desperate as the seconds ticked by. They seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. They were losing ground, and they would do anything to stop Elias from disabling the weapon. But they underestimated the human spirit. Elias could feel the presence of the crew behind him, each person standing their ground, refusing to let the enemy take another step closer. He focused on the console, his eyes narrowing as a final line of code appeared before him. This was it. He didn't hesitate. His fingers slammed down on the final sequence, and for a moment, everything went silent. The energy field surrounding the super weapon hummed one final time, then flickered and disappeared entirely. The weapon, vulnerable now, stood before him, its core still pulsing with energy, but without the protection it had once had. "Now," Elias shouted, his voice breaking through the tense silence. The team surged forward, firing at the weapon's core with everything they had left. The alien forces, now desperate to prevent the destruction of their ultimate weapon, moved to intercept, but they were too late. The blasts from human weapons struck the super weapon's core, and a shockwave of energy rippled out in every direction. The Elysian shuddered as the shockwave reverberated through its hull, and Elias was thrown to the ground. The ship groaned, the walls buckling. But the weapon, the heart of the alien fleet's power, had been destroyed. For a brief moment, everything was still. The sounds of battle faded, and the only thing Elias could hear was the pounding of his own heart. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his body aching from the exhaustion of hours of fighting. But amidst the devastation, there was a sense of victory. Against all odds, they had done it. But just as Elias began to allow himself a moment of relief, the ship's alarms blared again, tearing through the stillness. The console in front of him flickered to life once more, and Mira's voice came through, strained and urgent. "Captain, you need to hear this," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "The invaders are retreating." Elias' mind struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. Retreating. But why? It looks like the superweapon was their only chance. Mira explained, her voice softer now, but still filled with awe. They're pulling back. It seems they didn't anticipate us being able to disable it." Elias took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the console as he pushed himself back to his feet. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity had something the enemy hadn't counted on: hope. The fleet had bought themselves a chance at survival. Mira's voice came again, her tone now filled with urgency. "Captain, they've withdrawn their main force, but there are still pockets of them scattered throughout our territory. We need to secure the fleet before they reorganize and return." Elias nodded, his mind already shifting gears. "We'll regroup and defend. We don't give them a second chance." As the Elysian limped through the wreckage of battle, the remaining ships of the fleet gathered in formation. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but humanity had made its stand. The loss of the Odyssey, the damage to the Aurora, and the countless lives sacrificed had not been in vain. The alien invaders, for all their strength and advanced technology, had been forced to retreat. They had underestimated humanity's will to survive. Elias stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond, knowing that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But the enemy had learned something today. Humans weren't to be underestimated. The strength of humanity lay not in their weapons, but in their determination, their ability to adapt and fight even when all seemed lost. And as long as they drew breath, the human race would continue to fight. The aftermath of the battle left the Elysian in tatters. The once pristine hull was now riddled with scorch marks and jagged scars from the intense firepower of the alien invaders. The bridge, though functional, had seen better days. Shattered panels and exposed wiring painted the reality of the conflict. But amidst the ruin, there was a quiet sense of victory. The invaders had been pushed back, their primary weapon destroyed, and humanity had not just survived. They had proven themselves capable of withstanding a force unlike any other. Elias stood at the bridge, his eyes scanning the remnants of the fleet. Ships that had once seemed invincible now floated in a state of ruin, some barely hanging on to their structure, others drifting aimlessly in the black void. The battle had cost them dearly, and the toll was visible on every deck. Yet, despite the wreckage, there was a sense of pride among the crew. They had fought not just for their survival, but for humanity itself. The quiet hum of the ship's engine was the only sound for a moment as Elias reflected on the carnage. He turned slowly to face the crew members who remained on the bridge. Mira, still at her station, her face a mix of exhaustion and determination, was working to reroute power to the ship's damaged systems. She didn't look up, but her presence was a reminder of the unwavering resilience of humanity. Around her, the rest of the crew moved with purpose, repairing what they could, their faces grim but resolute. They had lost friends, comrades, and ships, but they had not lost hope. "Status update," Elias said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "What do we have left?" Mira glanced up at him, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow before returning to her work. "We've lost contact with several of the ships. The Aurora and the Sentinel are barely holding together, and we got about 40% of the fleet still operational. We're a long way from being able to mount any more offensive operations, but we've stopped the worst of it." "Good," Elias replied. He walked to the viewport, gazing out at the debris scattered across space. The dead ships of their enemies, too, floated in the void, a silent testament to the carnage. It was hard to reconcile the victory with the cost. For every alien ship that had been destroyed, there had been a loss on their side. The bodies of their fallen comrades, many of whom had fought to the bitter end, would be left behind, adrift in space. "We're alive," Elias murmured, almost to himself. "But we're not done yet." Mira looked up, a slight frown crossing her face. "What's the plan, Captain?" "They'll regroup, and we won't have enough to push them back again." Elias turned back to her, his face a mask of calm determination. "We hold the line. We fortify what's left of our fleet, and we send word to the colonies. Reinforcements are on their way. They don't know it yet, but they'll be here soon." "But what if they're already regrouping? What if we don't have the time?" Elias felt a chill run down his spine, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He had no answers, only a deep, gnawing sense of urgency. "Then we buy time. We do whatever it takes to keep them from getting their strength back." The room was quiet for a moment, the crew absorbing the weight of his words. There was no grand plan, no miracle cure for their situation, only their resolve to keep fighting, to stay alive. Elias moved toward the comm station, where Lieutenant Soren was seated, his hands flying over the console as he worked to maintain communication with the other ships. "Lieutenant, get me in contact with the other ships. We need to make sure everyone knows we're still in this fight." Soren nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Aye, Captain. I'll send out the signal now." As Elias watched the tactical map of their fleet unfold before him, a thought lingered in his mind. This wasn't just a battle between fleets anymore. It was a test of humanity's spirit. The aliens had come to crush them, to wipe them from existence, and for a moment, they had seemed unstoppable. But they hadn't counted on humanity's refusal to surrender, on their ability to adapt, to improvise, and to endure. The aliens, with all their superior technology and overwhelming numbers, had underestimated the human will to survive. As the comms crackled and the faces of the remaining fleet commanders filled the screen, Elias felt a surge of determination. They were battered, scared, and few in number, but they weren't out yet. "All ships," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with a fire that ignited the hearts of his crew. "We've shown them what we're capable of. We've taken their best shot, and we're still standing. Now, we fight to win. We'll regroup, we'll reinforce, and we'll make sure they never forget what happens when they mess with humanity." The commanders on the screen nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They, too, had seen the horrors of the battle, but they had also seen the strength of their people. They understood the stakes. "Understood, Captain," one of them replied. "We'll hold position and prepare for a counterattack. The enemy may be strong, but we've learned something. They bleed." Elias smiled, a grim but knowing smile. "Exactly. They bleed. And we're going to make sure they remember that." As the communication ended and the fleet commanders went to work on their respective ships, Elias stood still, his mind replaying the battle, every loss and every small victory. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and danger, but one thing was certain: the human race would never give up. They had faced extinction, and they had fought with everything they had. The aliens had learned that humanity was not to be taken lightly, and now the universe would know the cost of underestimating them. They were not just a species to be swept away. They were a force to be reckoned with. Elias turned back to the view of the stars, his gaze hard and unwavering. The battle wasn't over, but humanity was far from finished. The days that followed were a blur of motion, the crew of the Elysian moving from one task to the next, scrambling to make sense of their new reality. The fleet had held its ground, but the war was far from won. The alien invaders, despite their retreat, had left scars that would take years to heal. The human fleet, once scattered and disorganized, was now forced to regroup, repair, and prepare for the inevitable return of the enemy. The stakes were higher than ever, and time was running out. Elias spent every waking hour in the command center, overseeing repairs, organizing missions, and coordinating with the remaining ships. The damage to the fleet was catastrophic. Ships that had once been symbols of humanity's technological prowess were now floating skeletons, patched up as best as they could be with what little they had left. Some of the ships wouldn't make it. Others would have to be cannibalized for parts. Yet, amidst all this, there was a flicker of hope. They were alive. They were still here, and they had something the aliens didn't: unity. The survivors, once a scattered, disparate group of crews and soldiers, had come together as one. Every division, every branch of the military, every technician, and every civilian who had been pulled into the war effort knew that the only way they could defeat this alien threat was by working together. The Elysian had become their rallying point, its crew the heart of the resistance. Elias, though exhausted, was more determined than ever. He had seen the cost of war, had felt the loss of friends and comrades, but every person who stood with him was proof that humanity's spirit could not be broken. They had faced the unthinkable, and they had come out on the other side, scared but undefeated. And that was something the aliens would never understand. They were invaders, conquerors, but they lacked the heart, the sheer will that coursed through the veins of humanity. It was the one thing they couldn't defeat, no matter how powerful their weapons or how advanced their technology. As he walked through the corridors of the Elysian, Elias passed through the makeshift medical bays, where injured soldiers were being treated. Many of the wounded would never walk again. Some would never speak. Others would carry the scars of the battle with them for the rest of their lives. But they were alive, and they were ready to fight again. There was a strength in that, a resilience that Elias knew the aliens had never anticipated. "Captain," Mira said, approaching him as he passed by one of the medical wards, "we've got new intel. The aliens are regrouping. They're preparing for another assault. We've got no time to waste." Elias nodded, his eyes steely. "What's their plan?" "They've retreated to a nearby star system. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're consolidating their forces, likely to launch a full-scale counterattack." Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had known it wasn't over. The aliens would be back, stronger and more determined. They hadn't just lost a battle. They had lost face, and that was something that would drive them to come back with a vengeance. "How much time do we have?" "Not much. They're already mobilizing. The window to strike first is closing fast." Elias took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. He knew this would be their last chance to finish the fight before the enemy regrouped and became too powerful to take down. If they didn't act now, they could lose everything. It was a gamble, but it was the only option they had. "We prepare for an assault," Elias said, his voice firm. "We hit them where it hurts. We take the fight to their home base, destroy their command centers, and cripple their forces. We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them." Mira nodded, already moving to relay the orders to the rest of the fleet. Elias' words were clear, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of humanity. If they failed here, if they didn't crush the alien threat now, there would be no second chance. The aliens would return, and the next time, they would be ready for everything humanity had to offer. As the preparations for the counteroffensive began, Elias found himself once again on the bridge of the Elysian, staring out into the black abyss of space. The stars seemed distant, cold, and uncaring. He could still see the remnants of the battlefield, the debris of the alien fleet floating in the vast emptiness, a ghostly reminder of the battle they had just fought. But that was all it was now. History. The future lay ahead, and it was unclear what it held. "All ships are ready, Captain," Mira reported, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "The fleet is standing by." Elias nodded, his hands clenched behind his back. "This is it. We strike now, and we strike hard." The order was given, and the fleet, what was left of it, moved into formation. Their mission was clear: infiltrate the alien star system, take out the enemy's command centers, and disrupt their ability to regroup. The stakes were higher than ever, but there was no turning back. They were committed. As the ships began their journey into enemy territory, the vastness of space seemed even more oppressive. The calm of the universe stood in stark contrast to the storm that was about to unfold. Elias knew that whatever happened next, this would be the defining moment for humanity. It would be a victory or a defeat, but there would be no in-between. The fleet moved as one, a single cohesive unit, every ship, every soldier, and every officer working together with a singular purpose. The silence was broken only by the hum of engines and the occasional comm chatter as they entered the heart of the enemy's territory. And then, without warning, the first shots were fired. A burst of energy lit up the dark expanse as the battle began anew. Elias' pulse quickened as the battle unfolded before him. The alien forces, though taken by surprise, quickly rallied and fought back with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Their ships, sleek and deadly, swarmed the human fleet with a devastating speed and efficiency. The initial assault had been a success, but now they were fully engaged in the fight of their lives. For hours, the battle raged. The Elysian and its allies fought tooth and nail, pushing forward with everything they had. The alien forces were formidable, but they were not prepared for the tenacity of the human fleet. They fought with the desperation of a species that had nothing left to lose, throwing everything into this final push. There was no retreat this time, no second chances. It was all or nothing. The tide of the battle ebbed and flowed, the human ships taking heavy losses, but pushing forward with relentless determination. Elias' eyes never left the battlefield, his mind focused entirely on the fight. He knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every way. But the one thing the aliens have forgotten to account for was humanity's will to fight. It was a force unlike anything they could have anticipated. It was what had kept them alive, what had allowed them to overcome impossible odds. And in the end, it was what would win the war. The battle dragged on for hours, but slowly the tide began to turn. The alien forces, battered and bruised, began to falter. Their ships, once sleek and powerful, now showed signs of weakness, their formations breaking apart under the sustained assault. The human fleet, though scared and bloodied, refused to relent. The Elysian led the charge, its crew pushing through with unyielding strength, determined to see this fight through to the end. And then, finally, it happened. The alien command ship, the heart of their fleet, was breached. The explosions that followed were massive, tearing through the vessel's hull and sending debris scattering into space. With their command center destroyed, the remaining alien ships, leaderless and disorganized, began to retreat. One by one, they fell back, unable to withstand the unrelenting push from the human fleet. Victory had been won. Elias stood on the bridge, his body weary and bruised, his face grim but resolute. The battle was over, but the war had left its mark. The enemy had been defeated, their fleet shattered, and their command structure obliterated. The victory was not without cost. The human fleet had suffered greatly, and many lives had been lost. But in the end, humanity had proven itself. Against all odds, against a force far stronger and more advanced than anything they could have imagined, they had prevailed. The stars outside the viewport seemed brighter now, the once empty void filled with the promise of a future that humanity would rebuild. It had been a hard-fought victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The alien threat had been vanquished, and humanity stood victorious, not because they were stronger or more advanced, but because they refused to give up. In that, humanity's true power lay. Elias looked out into the stars, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. They had won this fight, but there would always be more battles ahead. Humanity would face new threats, new challenges, but they had learned something valuable. That as long as they fought together, as long as they refused to surrender, they could face anything. And that, Elias knew, was the key to humanity's future. The war was over, but humanity's story had only just begun.